Now we turn to the latest in Russia's war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin says there will be no peace until his country achieves its goals there. The Russian president made those remarks at his end-of-year news conference. The event was more like a town hall, televised from a Moscow studio in front of a live audience of about 600 people. It was a marathon session lasting about 4 hours. It's the first time since Putin ordered the invasion in Ukraine that he's faced the Russian public and media in this way. And the CBC's Briar Stewart watched Putin's wide-ranging news conference. Briar, of course, you've been tracking this story for a few years now. What really stood out to you?
Well, I think what stands out is this is the kind of environment that Putin really relishes. I mean, we talk about it being a town hall, a marathon session at that, but it was carefully controlled. Organizers said that 2 million questions were submitted ahead of time. A few of those were asked to the president, but a lot of the questions really came from Russian journalists that were in the audience. And there was a range of topics, a lot of domestic issues like the economy, the price of food. He was also asked whether he played chess, what he dreamed about as a child, and at one point there was an AI-generated image of Putin, with Putin asking Putin whether or not he had body doubles. But of course, there were quite a few references to Ukraine, and Putin talked about how Russia's goals haven't changed, and he really kind of took the opportunity to talk about the debate going on right now with military aid to Ukraine and the friction in Washington, D.C. about whether the U.S. will provide tens of billions of dollars more. And that is something that he talked about, kind of the aid drying up. Take a listen.
Today, Ukraine virtually produces or manufactures nothing. They have been trying to maintain their manufacturing capability, but, actually they have been importing things for free, freeloading, but, it will come to an end sooner or later.
Now, there were a number of questions that were submitted from women, from the family members of some of the men who have been mobilized and are fighting in Ukraine. We talked to one woman who said she submitted a question saying, when would this all end? When would the soldiers be allowed to return back home? None of those were addressed to Putin in this town hall. But he did talk about how we didn't think there was a need for a second wave of mobilization now. And he said more than 600,000 Russians are currently fighting in Ukraine.
And Briar, Putin announced last week he'd be running for re-election in the spring. How are the Russian people viewing him nearly 2 years into the war on Ukraine?
Right, and I think that's what this event really played into, is just it was an opportunity to kind of present himself as powerful and confident. And this event, of course, was canceled last year. It came at a time when Russia was suffering mounting losses in Ukraine. Now it's a little bit different of a situation. But, of course, Putin has signaled that he's going to be running again in an election that is widely considered not to be free or fair. Putin will likely win the election and would secure another 6-year term as president. And I spoke with a Russian researcher from the University of Manchester who studies Russian propaganda. And he talked about how with the election and Putin's announcement to run again, it really just, it doesn't mean that people support him all across the board, but they just really have no choice. Take a listen.
I think the reason why many people support him is not because he's the best president, but because the propaganda and the regime, they created this impression that there are no alternatives, right? So Putin is the only person who is able to end this war. And since there are no other candidates, and there are no other candidates because of political repressions, they see them as the only sort of viable person to run the country.
And of course, he mentioned there just how there really is no opposition to speak of. So many of the politicians have either had to flee the country and are living in exile, or you have opposition members who are in prison. And we have to remember that when we're talking about potential re-election, it was Putin in the first place who changed the Constitution in order for him to run again and extend the term from 4 years to 6.
Thanks for this, Briar. That is the CBC's Briar Stewart in London. We do want to stay on the story. For that, I want to bring in Bill Broader. He is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. He's also the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He's also the author of Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. Bill, thank you for making time for us today.
Great to be here.
So as you heard in the report there, Putin has said that there will be no peace in Ukraine until his goals are achieved. What do you make of that statement?
This is exactly the same statement he made before the war, after the war started, and continues to make. And the one mistake that we make in the West is some fantasy that there is a possibility of some type of negotiation for peace. Putin has no intention of negotiating on anything. And in fact, that whatever probability of a negotiation continues to diminish as countries like the US, Canada, and the EU are now squabbling about further funding for Ukraine. And so he's been very transparent. He's carrying on, and Ukraine has only one choice, which is to carry on as well.
You know, you touched on there how when it comes to support for Ukraine during the course of this invasion, there has been somewhat waning support, and a lot of that has to do with finances, extra supports. We saw that play out in the United States as well. How crucial is ally support at this stage?
Basically, Ukraine is running out of bullets. They're running out of missiles, they're running out of ammunition. And unless we continue to provide that for them, then they will be demolished, that Putin will succeed, that what he thought was going to last 3 days, he'll succeed in 2 years. And by the way, if Putin does succeed, he doesn't stop in Ukraine. He then moves on to the Baltic countries, who are members of NATO. And then we have a choice. Do we want to go directly to war with Russia? Or do we want to tear up the NATO treaty and let him have his way? And so this is not a minor issue which we can just sort of push into the future and worry about other things. If we stop funding Ukraine, Ukraine loses, and then we get sucked into this war.
You know, I do want to switch gears for a moment because we were listening to our reporter saying 2 million questions were submitted, and from those, certain questions were then put towards Vladimir Putin. No questions, I don't believe, made it about Alexei Navalny and his whereabouts. Lawyers for that Putin critic say they've entirely lost contact with him. So how worried are you about Navalny's safety?
Well, I read a report yesterday to say that they moved him to Moscow to face another criminal trial. It hasn't been reconfirmed since I've read that report. It came out of Radio Free Europe. But we should all be concerned about Navalny's safety. He's the one person who has truly stood up to Putin, who is very popular in Russia, and who they tried to kill. And so the fact that he's in the custody of the would-be assassins is terrifying. And particularly in a year that Putin is, quote, running for re-election, he doesn't want anybody, particularly someone as popular as Navalny, to be on the scene at all.
Let's talk a little bit about context when it comes to Navalny and what role he played. And it was a significant one when we're looking at the leadership of Putin and why it is, of course, that Putin doesn't want to discuss Navalny at all.
Well, the one thing you need to understand about Putin is that he never discusses the names of his enemies. He always refers to that person, that lawyer, that activist. It's like a mafia thing, because if you don't name their names, they don't exist. They're not humans, and you can do whatever you want with them. And that's how he feels about Navalny. And for what it's worth, Navalny is the kind of person who, when he's able to communicate with his followers, can get millions of people out in dozens of cities around Russia to protest. And it's the kind of thing where if Navalny was allowed to sort of carry on, he would probably end up being the next president of Russia. As your previous guest mentioned from the University of Manchester, Putin is not popular. It's just that they've either killed, exiled, or imprisoned anybody who has been at all popular. And so it's kind of like playing football and on an empty field where there's nobody standing in your way, and then kicking the ball in the goal and saying, cheers, we won. Well, it's cheating. He's cheating. That's what Putin does.
And, finally, I wanted to ask you, when we are looking at the re-election campaign of Vladimir Putin, no real opposition at this stage that we're really aware of. And then you put that with also the situation involving Ukraine. I'm wondering what you foresee in the coming year.
Well, first and foremost, Putin has to look tough. He can't show any sign of weakness. He can't show any sign of compromise. And it's particularly true in and I would call this a fake election, in a fake election year when he's got to create the image that he's a winner, he's a strong man, and he's the guy who's going to guide Russia into the future. And so we shouldn't expect any leniency in any possible way while Putin is, quote, running for re-election. But furthermore, I wouldn't expect any leniency at any point ever, because he's so scared of losing his job. If he loses his job, he goes to jail and dies, that he's going to do everything and anything to stay in power, both before this fake election and after.
Bill, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your insights. That is Bill Browder. He is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign.